It's 3:05. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. My name is Adam Lowe. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Sciences here at the University of Pretoria. And it's my great privilege to welcome you all today to the third and final book launch in this month of August that's been hosted by the Center for Asian Studies in Africa, or CASA for short. Just a small disclaimer, although it's a book launch, there won't be any of the books physically sold here today, but there is one copy floating around for those who are curious. Please just ensure that it does return here. The book is titled Southern Interregnum, Remaking Hegemony in Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. It was published this year by Manchester University Press, co-authored by Gunvald Nilsen, the director of CASA, Chin-Quan Lee, Rui Braga, Fabio Luis Barbosa dos Santos, and Carl van Holt. Southern Interregnum is the product of teamwork that has been folded since 2016, when a group of sociologists working on Brazil, India, China, and South Africa first got together to discuss how to best understand the political economy of emerging powers in the global south. 9 years since the process began, they've emerged with this book, which can be described as a comparative conjunctural analysis of elite projects to reconcile accumulation and legitimation in the global south, working with Gramscian theories and concepts centered on the interregnum as an enduring period of instability and uncertainty in which hegemonic authority erodes and competing projects for crisis resolution emerge. The book proposes a novel reading of the convulsions that are currently reshaping the political economy of the global south and the world system. 3 of the authors are here to talk about the book. Stop sharing here. Are here to talk about the book, the overarching perspective that informs the analyses and arguments that are put forward, and the key points that are made about the country case studies that form the core of the book. Brazil, India, China, and South Africa with an asterisk, which I'll explain now. The authors will speak in the following order. Alf Nilsen will introduce the general argument of the book. Thereafter, the chapters will be discussed by the respective authors in the order that they appear in the book. Fabio dos Santos will discuss Brazil, Alf will discuss his India chapter, and then C.K. Lee will discuss China. Unfortunately, the author of the South Africa chapter, Carl van Holt, has temporarily lost his voice, so he won't be presenting today. Following all of this, today's discussant, Anthony Bezos, also based here at the University of Pretoria, will respond to the authors. He will speak for roughly 15 minutes, after which the audience will be invited to comment and ask questions. And I ask that you keep these short and to the point in the interest of time. Thank you all for joining us here today at yet another special CASA event in the lounge at Old College House. Alf, over to you.
Yeah. It's not coming out there. Okay, we'll have to do with small images of my co-authors, unfortunately, because of the various tech issues that we had. I'm going to speak a little bit about a general argument of this book. Southern Interregnum is a book about ongoing geopolitical transformations, and particularly about the political economy of emerging powers such as Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, which play key roles in driving and shaping those transformations. Our book starts with a survey of the Western mainstream media landscape as it looked in 2023, when, contrary to what is usual, the global south loomed large in the headlines of outlets such as the Financial Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian. The general message carried in op-eds and reports was that the early 21st century was the hour of the global south. Strong economic growth across Asia, Latin America, and Africa had been translated into greater geopolitical power, which in turn meant that the global south was no longer simply replying, "How high, sir?" when the global north commanded the darker nations to jump. This narrative is not one that only circulates among media pundits. It's also very common in scholarly analysis and commentary, where academics of different conceptual and political shadings have argued that we are witnessing a gradual developmental convergence between the global north and the global south, as a result of high levels of economic growth. The geopolitical dimension of this convergence is typically referred to as multipolarity, and the BRICS Plus formation is frequently thought of as the foremost manifestation of the fact that we now live in a multipolar world. Alternative reading of the current conjuncture in the global south. It is true, we argue, that a significant material expansion has taken place across the global south, but this expansion has been uneven and deeply unequal. As a result of that, southern working classes live in and with constant precarity. It's also true that our current world order is multipolar, but there's no credible evidence to suggest that multipolarity will yield just and equitable futures. Governing elites across the global south are, after all, commonly deeply invested both in the super exploitation of labor and in the authoritarian governance of its citizens. We need to get muted there, guys. So, to continue. Please mute that. So to continue, this scenario testifies to the fact that the developmental potential of neoliberalism has been exhausted. The fact that the 2010s was a decade of mass protest against both inequality and authoritarianism across the global south, and that this pattern has continued into the first half of the 2020s, lend further credence to this argument. So, what is the current conjuncture then, if not a moment in the rise of the global south? We argue that the global south is in the throes of what Antonio Gramsci called an interregnum, a deep and protracted crisis in which an old hegemonic order is dying, but a new order cannot be born. More concretely, this interregnum manifests as a disjuncture between the imperatives of accumulation and legitimation in emerging powers across the global south. Governing elites are therefore under pressure to reconcile those two imperatives. And at the heart of our book is a comparative conjunctural analysis of how this is being done in Brazil, India, South Africa, and China. On that note, I'm going to hand over to Fabio to give us a brief overview of the Brazilian trajectory in and through the Southern Interregnum. Fabio, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alf. Do you hear me well?
We hear you fairly well, but you'll have to speak up a little bit.
Okay. Thank you for putting this together, the book, and the opportunity to present the book. So, when Lula's 2 terms as president of Brazil ended in 2010, the international prestige of Brazil and the Workers' Party he led was at its peak. 1 year earlier, the Economist had portrayed Rio de Janeiro's Christ the Redeemer statue rising like a rocket with the caption, "Brazil takes off," while then US President Barack Obama considered Lula to be the most popular politician on earth. 10 years later, Brazil was again making headlines, but for a different reason. In 2018, Brazilians elected as president a former military man, Jair Bolsonaro, who personified the most aggressive traits of both authoritarianism and neoliberalism. Bolsonaro's election victory was preceded by the controversial impeachment that ousted President Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party in 2016, and by Lula's imprisonment, which prevented him from running for the presidency 2 years later. In this context, progressive expectations gave way to a reactionary offensive on a scale that had been unthinkable just a few years earlier. In the chapter, we analyze this shift in Brazilian politics as being symptomatic of the demise of the New Republic, the New Republic being the period that followed the end of military dictatorship in 1985. On this reading, the downfall of the PT and the rise of Bolsonaro appear as manifestations of a departure from the principles that underpin the New Republic, and above all, the so-called citizen constitution. Bolsonaro's election, we argue, was a provisional response to the challenge of reconciling accumulation and legitimation in a turbulent conjuncture. The fact that Lula and the PT made a comeback in the 2022 presidential elections is expressive of the contradictory tensions of this conjuncture. It is part and parcel of the Interregnum, not a sign of its resolution. Written in 1988, the Citizen Constitution was centered on the precept of wage citizenship, which modeled on Western welfare state would emerge from the convergence of formal work relations and social rights. However, as neoliberalization unfolded across the 90s and into the early 21st century, economic austerity eroded the Brazilian social fabric and produced a new subjectivity marked by competition of all against all. This took place against the backdrop of deindustrialization and different forms of accumulation by dispossession. In this context, the PT regime, which ruled the country between 2002 and 2016, is best understood as the last hegemonic project that attempted to reconcile accumulation and legitimation within the parameters of the new republic. Conversely, the rise of Bolsonaro and his presidency between 2018 and 2022 heralded the unraveling of those parameters. Although he was not the only politician flagged the PT's corruption and championing a radical brand of neoliberalism, the former captain did have something that others did not, and that was votes. However, Bolsonaro's presidency did not provide a durable solution to the legitimation challenges faced by Brazilian elites. On the contrary, it added volatility and unpredictability to an already unstable context. This was in no small part because his popular appeal was built on a violent performative style which nurtures political instability. This was in turn counterproductive from the point of view of capital. For example, it tends to act as a disincentive to foreign investment. Within this conjuncture, Lula's return is unlikely to halt the erosion of the new republic. Rather, it indicates that Brazil's elite is both internally divided and uncertain about how to decisively move beyond the parameters of the citizen constitution. In Gramscian terms, the elites have so far been unable to unify around the hegemonic project that provides direction to the country. In our chapter, we analyze how Bolsonarismo attempted to build hegemony. We began by exploring how contradictions in the PT regime explain the shift towards Bolsonaro. We interpret this as a transition in terms of how Brazil's ruling classes go about the business of governing social tensions in society. Above all, we note that there has been a transition from inclusive neoliberalism to authoritarian neoliberalism, set against the backdrop of the decline of the new republic. We also point out how the incompatibility between the constitutional parameters of the new republic became particularly evident during the short interlude between Rousseff's impeachment in 2016 and Bolsonaro's ascension to the presidency 2 years later. The chapter then moves on to focus on how Bolsonarismo sought to construct a hegemonic project along both horizontal and vertical axes, that is to say, in relation to different elite groups and in relation to subaltern groups. Rather than a coherent national project, we discern sets of elective affinities that explain the attachment of both elite groups and subaltern groups to Bolsonarismo. We start by looking at elective affinities from above and focus on the relations between the police state embodied by the military and the neoliberal fundamentalism of the economy minister Paulo Guedes, who was Bolsonaro's main link to finance and big business. We then move on to analyze elective affinities from below, concentrating on how the entrepreneurial subjectivities fostered by neoliberalization fused with conservative values of evangelical churches to generate support for Bolsonarismo among subaltern groups. What emerges is a reading of authoritarianism as something more than the exercise of coercive power. In contrast to Cold War times, this brand of authoritarianism is elected and relies on widespread popular support. As it turned out, Bolsonarismo was not a durable project, at least not in its initial avatar. Lula returned for another presidency after the 2022 elections. In line with the argument developed in the chapter, we propose that whereas the return of a more conciliatory politic around ruler may constitute a setback to elites seeking a way, an exit out of the new republic, the current moment is most likely a temporary ceasefire, a sort of a truce. New hegemonic struggles are likely to erupt in the near future if they ever subsided. This is to be continued. In 2026, Brazil faces presidential elections again. That's what I had to say in 8 minutes.
Right, thank you, Fabio. CK, Prof, if you can go next.
Exactly my turn.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Apologies for that, Alf, please. There you go.
Tonight. Just following the order of chapters. Right, so I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the analysis, the arguments that I put forward in the chapter that I've written about India in this book. I'm sure that many of you will have heard that India is a nation that's surfing on a rising tide of economic growth. After all, according to the country's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, India is set to soon become the world's third largest economy, surpassed only by the US and by China. Now, the starting point for my chapter on India is the fact that this narrative, like so many other narratives that are peddled by Modi and his many, many acolytes, is brazenly false. India, it's important to understand, is in a deep state of social crisis. Just consider these numbers for a moment. India is a middle-income country in which more than 80% of the population lives on less than $5.50 a day. And while the country boasts a steadily rising number of dollar millionaires, every year Forbes comes out with its billionaire report, and every year it celebrates the fact that India has more and more dollar billionaires. The poorest 50% of the population earns a mere 13% of all income and owns only 6% of all wealth in this emerging power. And while Modi has introduced one pro-corporate policy after the other, India's growth has been largely jobless, and working-class wages have been more or less stagnant since he took power in 2014, that is, for more than a decade. However, this social crisis has yet to morph into a political crisis for Prime Minister Modi and his party, the right-wing Hindu nationalist BJP, which has held power since 2014. At the heart of this fact lies a particular achievement, which is that Modi and the BJP has managed to consolidate a vote base among India's religious majority, the Hindus. That vote base has been consolidated across the lines of class and across the lines of caste that normally splits the Hindu vote. It goes in different directions to different political parties. What Modi has managed to do is to bring together more than 40% of the Hindu electorate to support his particular party. And a key part of the reason for that is that he has managed to increase his support among lower caste groups and the working poor. His party was previously predominantly a party that had support among upper caste groups and among the urban middle class. It's true that the BJP lost its majority in the 2024 general election and that it now governs through a coalition, but its major losses were concentrated in one particular state in North India. And there was no major decline in support for the party among lower caste groups and the working poor on a national level. So how do we explain that paradox then? The suggestion at the heart of my chapter is that we need to understand how the BJP's hegemonic project, centered on what I call neoliberal Hindu nationalism, has managed to harness distinctive structures of feeling among India's subaltern citizens, its working poor, its lower caste groups, and so on. Let me break down that argument into its simplest constituent elements. First of all, Hindu nationalism is an ideology which posits that India is and should be a Hindu nation, and that the country's Hindu majority is under threat from its other, which is above all India's Muslim minority. It's incredible, isn't it, how dominant majorities are so incredibly fragile in their dominance or their perception of their own dominance. Now, that particular ideology has been propagated throughout Indian society by a reactionary social movement network that is commonly referred to only as the Hindu nationalist movement, which has been operative since the 1920s, so for more than a century. And the BJP has been the political wing of that movement since the early 1980s. What's happened under Modi is that Hindu nationalism has come to form the core of an authoritarian populism that draws a line between the authentic Indian people and its enemies within, which are, above all, the Muslim minority, but also dissidents, also critical academics, public intellectuals, what have you, media. And in relation to the Muslim minority, it has drawn that line between the authentic people and its enemies within through, first, vigilante violence against Muslim citizens, brazenly so, carried out by groups that belong to the Hindu nationalist movement, but also through new legislations and policies that effectively undermine Muslim citizenship in India. However, there's more to this hegemonic project. Under Modi, Hindu nationalism has also come to be closely fused with some very familiar ideological tropes of neoliberalism. The Hindu nation, Modi and the BJP tells its followers, is also a rising nation that is no longer stuck in history's waiting room, but on its way to claim its rightful place as a prosperous and powerful civilization at the high table of the world economy and world politics, and entrepreneurial citizens who are also simultaneously authentic Indians by virtue of being Hindu can come along on that ascent to prosperity and power. This neoliberal Hindu nationalism is propagated not just by the BJP, but by the wider Hindu nationalist movement through its dense cellular network, which stretches out into Indian society, mobilizing specific sectors and groups, women, students, farmers, workers, what have you. And also it is coupled to a bare-boned welfare policy, which is focused on Modi's persona, as in whatever little welfare you receive is a gift from the benign ruler to his subjects. What this hegemonic project has managed to do is to harness structures of feeling among all caste groups and the working poor, in which aspirations of social mobility and affluence interlock with anxieties of social decline and fears of that ominous other. And I draw on W.E.B. Du Bois when I argue that what this hegemonic project offers to India's subaltern citizens is the gratification of the psychological wages that are embodied in this double promise of development, which appeals to people living just on the brink of abysmal poverty, and dignity through the recognition of the Hinduness of lower caste groups who are the poorest, the most exploited, the most oppressed sections of Indian society. No, you are actually Hindus. You are part of this community. You are part of this great nation. And the onward march of that particular hegemonic project, it is true, has faced its ruptures and challenges, protests, for example, against anti-Muslim citizenship legislation in 1919 and 1920, farmers' protests that eventually brought about the suspension of a neoliberal agricultural policy. But overall, what stands out after more than 10 years in power for Modi and his party is its remarkable durability and resilience. I'll stop there.
Professor Lee, and you can go now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, perfect.
Okay, I'll speak up. Well, first of all, it's very good to join you in the same room where I spoke last August. Today I joined virtually, but still it's good to feel like I was in the same room. I'm going to switch gear when talking about China and the hegemonic project there. I think for the Chinese, which if you compare what you just heard about Brazilians and Indians, the Chinese are more materialistic. The hegemonic project in China has to do with sustaining growth because economic growth is also primarily a legitimation issue, not just an accumulation issue. Nationalism, the issues that you just heard, nationalism, identity politics, even electoral mobilization really play second fiddle in China as a hegemonic strategy compared to ways to sustain economic growth. I think across the chapters, our common starting point to talk about this conjuncture is really 2018, the financial crisis, and how all these different southern countries responded to this moment, a crisis moment for neoliberalism. So my chapter really began there and tried to figure out or try to explain why or how the Chinese elite reacted to this moment of global crisis. The Chinese officials like people to believe, like the West to believe, that China was not affected by this crisis. As a matter of fact, the official rhetoric was that this financial crisis from originating from Wall Street revealed the inferiority of the US-led model of capitalism, its very destructive speculative bubbles and lack of regulation, and that China, with its distinctive type of state capitalism or socialism, is better, is not affected by it. But that's far from the truth. The truth was that 2008 did affect China in very profound and adverse ways. It's a wake-up call to the elites that maybe a strategy of relying on the West to absorb all the exports as a primary site of growth has exhausted, and China needed a different major strategy to sustain growth, which was also a legitimation, the basis of legitimation why people supported or didn't rebel against a one-party rule. So 2008 was absolutely critical for us to understand how the elite were able to hang on to power and how they responded. I would say, with mixed results, their strategies. 2008 was also a very important point for them to switch gear because around that time, the West, many different parts in the world, have seen social upheavals and mass movements that Alf just mentioned. The Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street. There were also the color revolutions in previous former communist countries, and all these created the specter of global uprising for the Chinese elite. So it is a moment where they have to think deeply how to react. And I think my chapter basically pointed out there are two strategies that they pursued. One is going digital, the other is going global, and both strategies had the goal of both overcoming overcapacity, trying to sustain growth, could develop new growth points in the economy, providing new employment opportunities, but also is a political strategy to enhance the party state's control over society, increase its governance capacity. But my argument is that both have created its own contradictions and have mixed results. And so going digital is the first strategy. It means creating the world's largest platform economy in both revenue, employment, and entrepreneurship, and huge state investment in AI. Now, recently, the West has been very scared of the result of this state investment in AI, which is DeepSeek. But there has been a lot of doubts as to whether it is as powerful as the Chinese government want to present it to the world. But anyway, going digital is to create, recalibrate the Chinese economy towards a digital future. And is also a tool of the state to impose mass surveillance and create an industry around this supply chain of mass surveillance. Xinjiang, which is the site of the most extensive and extreme lab for this application, both economic and political, is just the tip of an iceberg. And now, as many of you may know, China is also exporting this digital economy to the rest of the world, in South Africa no less. It's called the Digital Silk Road. So that's the first strategy, and it has created its own contradiction, both obviously in the crackdown on big tech titans, individuals, but also corporations. Big tech has grown so big that it becomes a rival to Big Brother. And we've seen Alibaba, the iconic corporation embodying the most powerful kind of digital economy of China. It has been at the brunt, facing the brunt of state crackdown. I'm not going into detail, but the government accused it of disorderly expansion of capital. And basically, it's a critique that we love to hear in the West. But in China, it means a class crackdown, basically telling the digital elite that you become too strong. And despite your contribution to the economy, you have to subject yourself to the party state. The second strategy is called going global. It predated 2008, but after 2008, as a response to the crisis, the state pursue it with more focus and energy. And in 2013, China announced the Belt and Road Initiative, that everybody is now familiar with. Basically, is an economic stagecraft to export capacity, building, construction capacity from China to the rest of the world, but also to grow diplomatic capital and political influence. But this loans for infrastructure is not the only means to pursue global China. Maybe less well known to many people is the use of patron clientelism to rekindle and expand its original United Front machinery. Basically recruiting supporters among international politicians, local elite, and revamping the diasporic network organizations in different parts of the world to support Beijing's bid in every way possible. And then symbolic domination is China's trying to buy ownership, of world's media organization. I've seen that happening in Zambia, newspapers, radios, and also nowadays social media platforms have been infused and infiltrated with lots of Chinese propaganda from the state to try to shape people's perception of China. Well, the contradictions here is that, China has not succeeded. There are lots of counteroffensives against this type of Chinese expansion around the world. Tariff and trade war is just one type of backlash most recently. But then around the world, we've seen different projects encountering different types of labor resistance, communal uprisings, and trying to push back at all these Chinese projects. Anyway, so the chapter, basically, the bulk of the chapter talks about these two strategies and the contradictions that they produce with mixed results. I think what I like to caution people when thinking about China is that we have to stop thinking that the Chinese governing elite always got it right, always have control, and always have foresight that the capitalist West cannot attain. The state can mobilize indeed a lot of resources and planning and to overcome market failure and inconsistent policies in democracies. But there are many problems that we have to be aware of. Growth rate, they managed to sustain pretty healthy growth rate, around 5%, a drop from the previous double-digit records in the previous decades, but still respectable. But employment is a problem. So growth, but not employment. There are tensions among the classes, the internal strife among the Chinese elite. I'm sure you've heard of these days in the media, in the US at least, and the West, is how the Chinese have, because of this brilliance of state planning and investment, is leading the world in renewable energy in different respects, and the West is really definitely falling behind. Yes, that's a success story that came out of this 2008 crisis when the Chinese government tried to pour a lot of resources into designated areas to boost growth. And renewable energy sector happens to be one of them and is bearing results. But don't forget the other disaster, which is the opposite of success, is the housing market, the collapse of the housing and land development market. That also came out of the 2008 economic stimulus and investment. So I want to caution people that don't just look at, the China story with the successes, but also the tremendous and very painful failures as well. My last point is, I think people would realize that since we completed this manuscript several years ago, the world seems to have moved on and have become a very different place, is on the verge of a paradigm shift in political economy. And readers may rightly ask, what are we doing to make sense of this book, which empirically seems like history, and is history that we have recounted here. And I want to say that historical analysis that these chapters present are very valuable because it shows that the dynamics, underlying dynamics, think of it as the stock market. The stock market goes up and down much more frequently, but the fundamentals of an economy stay, pretty much. It's a long-term thing, and it's more structural. And I hope our chapters have pointed out to some of those more structural dynamics that these big ships, big countries in the global south have to deal with. And what people should read is the dynamics that we reveal. And the search for fixes in these economies will continue, and we'll see all these changes in empirical details. But what we focus on is the dynamics among the elites. The calculations hopefully will survive all these changes of appearances. The essence of their calculations will stay the same. Okay, I'll have to stop here. Thank you.